we were in for 12 years. Hoddesdon is a classic dormitory town. The only thing that people do in Hoddesdon is sleep. They don't play there, they don't work there. When we were there, they didn't shop there. So if you went in the high street about 4:30 in the afternoon, it was like a desert. Well, it was like that at midday as well. It was a classic dormitory town with all the challenges about ownership and community. And also, I don't know whether this is true generally of Community Bell, but a massive turnover of people. People were with you for 3 to 5 years. And that old thing about you needed to get to know people before you trusted them, that just didn't work because they'd left. So it was quite an interesting place. And in 1994, I started in 94. About 1997, I picked up a book that was entitled, Where Do We Go From Here? And that kind of summed up where I was feeling, because I was really busy leading this church, and it was a good church and things were going well. But I was beginning to ask the question, so what's the point? Why do we do all these things? What was the fruit of it? And it was by Ralph Neighbour, and it was a book about Cell Church. And we went on a journey. Some of you who are old enough will remember when Cell Church was the thing. Do you remember that? Yeah, it was kind of, it was the latest silver bullet, wasn't it? This was going to solve all our problems. Well, we were about a year ahead of that. And I used to get wheeled out by Cell UK as the man who broke all the 7 golden rules, or whatever they were, because we just went for it. And I think instinctively what appealed to me about it was this. It was a structure within which, it was a structure that was designed to try and make disciples. And I wasn't sure that our structures were actually doing that. The reality is, and this is not a criticism of Hoddesdon Baptist Church, we still go back there, we love them to bits. But I think the reality, looking back, is that we were not able to bring about any kind of core change to the culture of the church to become a disciple-making church. But we did see a lot of people come to faith. Alpha worked really well. We learnt a lot about people of peace and how significant they are. We learnt a lot about discipling people who live very chaotic lives with very little Christian background. And then in 2006 we were called to Dereham, right in the heart of Norfolk. When we lived there, I used to jokingly say we're the F in Norfolk. Before you get offended, just look at the map. We're literally right in the heart. The geographical centre of Norfolk was in Dereham's Tesco car park. It's a completely different community, and atypical really of Norfolk towns, because it was an incredibly welcoming place. And that was partly due to rapid growth. In the 1960s, it was a town of 5,000. Within 40 years, it was 20,000, with a lot of people coming. So it's a very, very different place. Well-established sense of community. And we were there for just over 10 years and really developed a different strategy there. I don't know about you, but I've never gone to a church with a plan. I've never gone to church with a plan. And is it still around where people say, oh, you've got a year to make any changes? Has that died now? Yeah, good. Because it's a load of rubbish, isn't it? Because I don't know about you, it's 3 years before I have any clue about what's going on in a church. So I've never went with a plan. I always went with, I wonder what God's been up to. And how could we accelerate and enable what God has been doing? So what developed was a variety of different missional models, if you like. And much more growing towards discipling people in situ. Rather than saying, come on a course, do this, but actually in the group that they were part of, or through the group that they were part of. So discipleship happened like that. And the best period in Dereham was when we didn't have the church for 4 months, because we did major refurbishment. This is the building after it was refurbished. It had already tatty beforehand. So for 4 months we met in a high school. There was an incredible sense of freedom that we didn't get in the building. But the best of those 4 months was the month when we couldn't have the school. And there was nowhere else in Dereham that was big enough to accommodate us. And so we multiplied into 4 different expressions of church on a Sunday morning. And actually out of that, missional things grew and developed. And so over the years, again, atypical for a Norfolk town, one of the things we had and developed was a Portuguese-speaking congregation that met on a Saturday night, and they brought life and vitality. And when we had bilingual services, something of heaven occurred with people singing in different languages at the same time. Just wonderful times. We looked to plant in a village. We worked with other Baptist churches to plant into a seaside town. We had various midweek gatherings with missional focus. We had 3 very different Sunday morning events, one of which was not in our building. So as that kind of multiplication out was going on, I also had the great joy of 2 Brazilian associate ministers. One led the Saturday night congregation. He worked part-time. The other guy was full-time. Some of you may, a guy called Jorge Damasceno, and I'll refer to him later. And the wonderful thing about Brazilians is their only experience of the church is that it grows. So they just assume that the church grows. I remember George saying to me, Pastor Chris, we could double this church in 2 years. Really? We didn't, but anyway. And I had no intention of leaving Dereham, actually. We just celebrated 10 years there. There were younger leaders coming through. And Lynn and I talk about Lynn and I, my wife and I, we kind of had in mind 3 to 5 years. Let's bring these younger leaders through. And then we'll either do some kind of transition, or if they prefer us just to get out of the way, we'll get out of the way. But as that began to happen, confession time, I don't always read the emails from the Baptist Union, even when I was a Baptist minister. But I did happen to read this one. And at the end, it just said this. It said, the churches of Telford and Shropshire are looking for a mission enabler. And I thought, oh, I'd love to do that. And one thing led to another. And just quite clearly what has happened subsequently in our family life and in the life of the church in Dereham. And it's very interesting what's happening in Dereham, that it does seem somehow that disciple-making DNA is more deeply rooted in that church, and actually they're pushing on further out and further in than we were doing with their new leaders, which is really encouraging. So, outline for the day. We're behind time already, but don't worry about that, because there's plenty of time, and I will honour the closing. We will be finished by 3:30, because I need to be in Telford by 5:30. So we definitely will do that. So if you want to talk with me, grab me over coffee and lunch, because I'm afraid I will not be hanging around afterwards. First session is a bit grandmother sucking eggs, and I'm sorry about that, but it lays some foundational stuff that you can begin to do some work, and you will begin to do some work towards the end of that first session. The second session, 5-fold ministry and disciple making, is a bit left field. But as I was preparing this, I just couldn't get away from it. It just kept coming back. So I thought, well, let's go for it. And you can be the judge of whether I got it right or not. And then after lunch, the graveyard slot, we'll be doing a bit more stuff around tables. I'll do some brief introductory stuff. We'll do some stuff around tables. And then we'll bring things together, actually by you as individuals thinking, where does the rubber hit the road? What am I going to do with this in my context? It's a slightly larger group than I anticipated, which is fantastic. But at any point, if you disagree with me, please speak up. If I've not made something clear, when I don't make something clear, just stop me, okay? Because some of this is opinion. So feel free. And again, this first session, 21st century Britain and the church colliding cultures, it was an attempt to tease you in a bit, but I think it does sum up where we are at the moment and the massive challenge we face as church leaders at this time in the 21st century. About 10 minutes away from where I live these days in Telford is one of the feature hills of Shropshire. It's called the Wrekin. And it's a real joy to have it there. But just across from that, and part of the same ridge, is a small hill called High Arkle. And High Arkle was extensively quarried. I'm not sure whether it was when they were building Telford or the M54 motorway. I can't remember which one it was. But in the blasting, they unveiled what I think You may be bored by it, but I find a fascinating geological feature, because as they blew it apart, what they discovered is Arkle, I know it's spelled Urkel, but, local pronunciation, all that stuff. Arkle granophyre and Wrekin quartzite, and this, I wish that was non-conformity where they met. But actually it's unconformity, never mind. But actually it's two different geological ages, and they meet at this point. You're not as fascinated as me, never mind. I think that's really interesting, that you get this point where two ages meet. And we're living in a similar age, aren't we? Two ages are meeting: the death of Christendom and whatever comes next. Name dropping, I was with the Archdeacon of Salop yesterday. And he put it like this, he said, our boat has got a hole in it. Talking about the structures. The boat has got a hole in it and we're sinking. We're sinking. If we're not yet in a post-Christendom society, it's certainly where we're heading. I mean, there are pockets of Christendom. So if you went with me to Whitchurch in North Shropshire, you would find Christendom. So over the kind of immediate Christmas period, I'm not talking about through Advent, the immediate Christmas period, over 10% of the population of the town, so over 1,000 people, will go through the church, the Anglican church. Huge numbers of baptisms and christenings, and weddings and funerals. Christendom, in which there are pockets of it, but that's the exception. And we're in one of those tipping points in history, aren't we? We've been there before in church history in our country, and God got us through it. And one of the things I discern, and if I'm not careful I'll go off on one here, but one of the things I discern actually is the way God has been preparing us for this. You look at the Talking Jesus statistics. Have you seen those? Yeah, if you haven't Googled Talking Jesus, ignore the first one, because I think that takes you to a Talking Jesus doll. But the research is fascinating. And I believe God has put us as the church in a really strategic place in society. Because over 2/3 of the population know an active Christian. That's massive market penetration. It's the kind of thing that McDonald's and Coca-Cola are after. Massive market penetration. Only 1% of the population, this is the population who do not come to church, this is non-believers. Only 1% know one of you, church leader, and they think really highly of us. So I think God's been putting us as the church in a really strategic place. Although through Christendom we lose the power base, actually our place in culture... Oh, sorry, I've gone off on one with that one, but really. So we're in a tipping point in history. And for that reason, actually on the ground for you guys, it's a tough place to be at times. It's an exhilarating place to be, but it also is tough. And I am with the Archdeacon. I think our Christendom structures are holed below the waterline. I don't think, and this is opinion, you can disagree with me, I don't think the way that we tend to do church actually will work in a post-Christendom context, because it was designed to operate within Christendom. And again, with the glorious thing about hindsight, I wonder whether it really did that anyway. Or to use somebody else's question, did we make church-shaped disciples, or did we have disciple-shaped churches? Did we make church-shaped disciples, or did we have disciple-shaped churches? In other words, did we just actually train people to become good church attenders or radical followers of Jesus? You can fill in the blank. And our challenge, of course, is that most of our church members are schooled in the Christendom way of doing church. And there's a number of sacred cows out there, and bringing change is tough, especially when actually the reality is we're not quite sure what the future shape of church is. And in all honesty, as I look back at my time as a young minister in Hoddesdon, I think sometimes I was saying to them, trust me, I've read a book. Sometimes it felt like this. Oh, sorry, that's another picture. Sometimes it felt like this, the old bungee run. Sometimes it felt like I was running to try and bring change, but the inertia of the Christendom model would kind of suck me back again. I think it comes with the territory, actually, as we live in this tipping point in history. I've been reading, I haven't finished yet, but one of the books I'm reading, I don't know about you, but I like to read 2 or 3 books at the same time, because something about my attention span. And I'm loving Walter Brueggemann's book on the land. And some of you will be very familiar with the kind of theological thinking that this movement from Christendom to post-Christendom is a bit like the exile in the Old Testament, where many of the familiar landmarks and actually the things upon which we depended are disappearing. Land, temple, king. And as he writes about that period, he's not writing specifically, he's kind of talking about the mood in Old Testament Israel, but I see huge connection here. He says the crunch at the end of that time in history concerns continuity and discontinuity. Landed folks want to cling to continuities and believe that old forms surely continue, but the wrenching of 587 and the discernment of the prophets are about discontinuity. The land is really lost, and history is really ended. There is no king, no temple, no royal city, no Israel. It's ended. But at the same time, those who dare to speak of a new history, now beginning, could do so only in terms of the old history, for they had no other images or models. But the use of such images invariably suggested that the old history really continues in some way, when surely it does not. But for all the continuity of images, this moment in biblical faith concerns clear, sharp discontinuity. We shall not understand the boldness and risk of announcing the new history rooted in exile, the life called forth from death, unless we see that the old history is ended. And I think there are real parallels there. That many of the things that are precious in Christendom, many of the images and our understanding of church actually are not going to work. There is a discontinuity about the whole thing. Anybody want to reflect anything on that? Yes, thank you.
Would you like to reflect on the fact that actually there was a re-establishment of the old with the
Yeah.
and the role that plays, say the role of Nehemiah in that process? Are we to recognise that perhaps there will be, if you like, God will have 2 teams?
I think there is. I think certainly as I look at the Anglicans, one of the things they've invested a lot in fresh expressions, haven't they? And one of the things they're realising actually, they need to pal up fresh expressions with what they would call inherited models of church, because there is learning that can go across both of those. And certainly I'm not going to reflect on the later Nehemiah, but I think there is a danger that we chuck the baby out with the bathwater. But at the same time, we do need adventurous new ways of doing things. Yeah, thank you.
There was a few years ago that there was a resurgence of interest in cathedrals.
Yes.
And church structure.
Yeah.
It sounds like nostalgia works.
There has been a significant rise in cathedral attendance. I understand when you dig down, the people attending are either they were churchgoers, they might be de-churched. Often there are people who also have got disillusioned with the relational aspects of church life, and actually going to cathedral worship is safer, isn't it? Because you go in, you worship, you go home. So my understanding is that rise in cathedral worship is not non-churched people. Yeah. Yeah.
Last night I was part of a study group from a political party, which was trying to move from being a party to a movement.
Yeah.
And similar conversations
Yes.
that I've had in my own churches
Yeah.
over the years,
Yeah.
the church groups as well. And so there is a very change in society,
Absolutely.
which is also beyond the church.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, towards then last year in Dereham, we went to a meeting of the Dereham the Dereham Society, whatever that was. And it was fascinating because this was a group of people who 30 years ago, it was a secular group, but they had the best interests of the town at heart. And they were thinking of disbanding. And so they had this public meeting. And what they drew in was a load of younger traders who had shops and small businesses within the town. And there was this huge dichotomy where the traditional Dereham Society wanted a chairman and a treasurer and a minutes and all this kind of business. And these younger traders were going, no, we'll do it on Facebook. It was about the same thing, but actually a completely different way of doing it. Yeah. Quite where that went, I don't know, because we moved to Telford. Yeah.
And I'm going, reflecting again on the situation in exile, part of the continuity which sustained the discontinuity was the priesthood.
Yes.
Like Ezekiel and many others who were exiled there and were probably the centre for sustaining the
Yes.
community. So how important are deeply discipled persons? And secondly, recapturing the liturgy, the Psalms, I mean, there was no other temple where they were.
Yes.
But did they sustain the faith? And how important is music and spiritual discipline into the future?
I think I would just say into that theological, biblical reflection lies at the core of it. And I think one of the advantages of the period of history that we're going through now is that it allows us to reboot to our core activity as the church, which is making disciples. Because if we don't do that, we're dead. We really are dead in the water. Thank you. I'm going to move on because we want to get to, and I'm going to do this fairly rapidly, okay? To me, that's a key verse, isn't it? You kind of get the 4 generations of discipleship in this, don't you? Paul disciples Timothy. Timothy then is able to disciple the next generation. And obviously in generations, we're not talking about ages, are we? We're talking about the continuity of the faith. So Paul disciples Timothy. Timothy is then able to disciple others. And those others are then able to disciple the others. That's what we're after, isn't it? I mean, years ago, an Anglo-Catholic guy, the guy who wrote the book Missionary Methods, St. Paul's or Ours, then wrote a later book called The Spontaneous Expansion of Christianity. And actually, if we get it right, and in another of the books there, Alan Hirsch's book, I've just put some books on that table over there. There's an Alan Hirsch book over there. I can't remember the title of it. Yeah, Forgotten Ways. And the whole thing that's gripped Alan Hirsch is the sense of a Jesus movement. You know, why is it that when the missionaries were taken out of China, the church just multiplied? What was going on there? When you look in church history. So there's a lot of work in there. This kind of holy grail, if I can use that word for us, of disciples who make disciples. Neil Cole, who's, again, some of his books over there, quite provocative writer, says this: if we cannot reproduce disciples, we'll never reproduce leaders. If we can't reproduce leaders, we'll never reproduce churches. If we can't reproduce churches, then we'll never see a true movement. And Cole, I think, takes us back to the very root of it. If we are going to be a movement as the Baptist Union, then at the heart of it must be disciple making, must be that ability to multiply disciples. Because if you can do that, then the other things flow on. And Cole makes a lot of emphasis on small. Get the small right, get the individual discipleship right, and the other things will flow. Get that right, and then it's reproducible and it's multipliable. And he works very hard. I mean, I commend his writings to you. He's a bit of a pain because he really doesn't believe in paid leaders. And it's occasionally you think, oh, for goodness sake, Neil, get off that hobby horse. And his structures are very different to ours, but I find he asks the right questions. And at the end of the day, he's got a method that works, that does reproduce disciples, does reproduce churches. It is a movement, and I'll use some of his stuff later on. Right, I'm going to move on to this. What's a disciple age? This really is a bit Mickey Mouse, but we need to do it. Can I say one assumption before you clobber me afterwards? I'm not going to mention prayer. Not because I don't believe in it, but I just assume you know that prayer underpins everything. Yeah? Can we just assume that before some of you prayerful people clobber me afterwards? It's not that I'm not prayerful, it's just, well, we'll see that in the fivefold later. So, one word to describe a disciple. Go on, shout them out. Well, that worked well, didn't it? Learner, yeah. Just shout them out. Follower. Apprentice, yeah. This is, you'll find on your tables these, and I can't remember your name. David Spriggs. Thank you, David, for bringing these. Andrew Roberts from the Methodist stable has produced a book, Holy Habits, really around spiritual disciplines, but holy habits for disciples. And he defines discipleship like this. Disciple one who learns as they follow. And I think there are two key words in there, aren't there, about learning and following. I love Dallas Willard's definition. Discipleship is the process of becoming who Jesus would be if he were you. Yeah, that is, I like that. Yeah. And actually that connects with the fivefold stuff that we'll look at after coffee as well. And a slightly wordy one, I don't know where this one came from, to be honest, but I suspect it came from the Mike Breen school. I suspect it comes from the missional discipleship, the missional community model, because it talks about character and kingdom. So discipleship is simply the process of becoming like Jesus. It's the process of having more and more of his character, which in turn allows us to do the things Jesus did. It's about being, the inside of us, heart and character, and doing the kingdom things Jesus could do out of his relationship with the Father. And throughout the whole thing about talking about disciple making, I am assuming that we also disciple non-Christians. That we're talking about helping people wherever they are on the old Engel scale, from that point of -10 where they don't even believe in God, through that point of +10 where we are so like Jesus it's unbelievable. Actually, we're looking to disciple people wherever they are on that spectrum. So just very quickly, how did Jesus make disciples? Just 3 things. You could easily preach this, couldn't you? They're all intertwined. Small group of community of 12. Actually, it was bigger than 12, wasn't it? Because when you get to Acts chapter 1, it also talks about the men who were with us from the beginning. But there was that core group as well. And then there were the 3, weren't there? Peter, James and John. But that was an interesting dynamic, wasn't it? And in fact, we see that dynamic in the Gospels, don't we? Where there is jealousy and envy within that. And again, it's this classic thing, isn't it? Jesus taught large numbers, but he discipled a small group. And so discipleship is small and intimate. It happened by doing life together in community, in ordinary life. As life happened, Jesus discipled the disciples. And so a child is used as an example. If you want to enter the kingdom of God, you need to become like this child. And then he says, feed this lot, and so on. And there's a load about their community life that we don't know. But discipleship is as much caught as taught, isn't it? Discipleship, actually, in good community, it's kind of osmosis. Because actually you catch a culture, you catch a way of thinking, you catch a way of living, which is also dangerous, because if our church culture is toxic, then actually that's what you learn by osmosis. And so with Jesus, it wasn't a 12-week course. It was 3 years, intensive, life on life, 24/7, and even then they didn't get it, did they? There are plenty of occasions when they didn't get it. And then there's also this thing, watch me then do it yourself, isn't there? Mission of the 12 and the 72, it didn't always work. The story after the transfiguration, as Jesus comes down from the mountain, makes that absolutely clear. But I think the interesting thing is that Jesus seemed to trust the disciples beyond where they were, actually beyond their ability, because that was a way of stretching them and growing them. So there is an element of risk in disciple making, being trusted to do things that we're not quite ready. But again, notice that happens within a supportive network. It happens with Jesus around and the others as well. So those are my 3 points. What would you want to add? That's reassuring. Yeah, no, go on. Thank you,
Did he
David.
actually teach them too?
Yes, he did. He did teach them. And we're going to come on to that. Yes. Yeah.
You've got a cross with them.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
He had a discernment of who they were,
Yes.
so he spotted them. It
That's
wasn't
right.
Just, right, that group over there. There was
Yeah.
a real sense of selection.
Yeah. And they were unlikely. Some of them were unlikely characters. Yeah.
Told and heard stories.
Yes. I just think parables are a very dangerous thing, aren't they? I mean, what a terrible way of teaching. Completely different to the way we do it, generally. Really interesting.
Were the parables for the disciples or the crowd?
Were the parables for the disciples or the Christ? I would be for both. That's hedging my bets, isn't it? No, I think it was for both, because it was, he who has ears to hear, let him hear, or those who have ears to hear, let them hear.
There's a slight disjunction, isn't there? Because he was God.
Really? Yes. Yeah,
And then we are also disciples ourselves.
that's right. We are, but again, one of the helpful things, I think it's out of St Thomas and Sheffield Network Church, and they talk about us being. Now, how does it work? From behind, we look like a shepherd, but from the front, we look like a sheep. So actually, we're in relationship with other people who are helping us grow, but also there are others behind us that we're helping to grow. I mean, the weakness of that analogy is that I have always found that when I'm discipling somebody, it helps me grow. And actually, the people who have helped me grow most have been explorers, because they don't know the traditional answer. So they read the Bible completely differently. And I've discovered stuff about God that I've never found in a nice, safe Christian Bible study group. Because we know what the answers are, don't we? And we tend to read the Bible a bit like that anyway. So, if being a disciple is about, thank you, David, about teaching, that's not on there at all. That's an omission. Thank you. So, how do people learn? If being a disciple is about following and learning, and this really is Mickey Mouse goes to learning theory, but never mind. Because in our society, people acquire knowledge, beliefs, values, skills. They are discipled in a certain way. And people have looked about how that works. So we're going to look at that very quickly. So, 3 ways. Socialisation. One of the joy of Lynn and I's life at the moment is our second granddaughter. Isabel is 10 and she's beginning to speak. Well, I'm told she's beginning to. I don't believe it, actually. I think she's just making noises at this stage. But apparently she says dada and nana. I haven't heard that yet. I've just heard a lot. But anyway, that's what parents are like, isn't it? You know, they want the child to say that. But she will learn to speak through socialisation because she is immersed in it every day. She learns it, she listens, she copies. What it isn't is intentional or formal. Isabel does not lie in her cot and one morning think, do you know, it's time I learn English. It doesn't work like that, does it? It's by socialisation. But as she gets older, then she will learn a second language, and that is a formal way of learning. So there are certificates and there are grades. You can track the progress, all that kind of thing, formal learning. And then the third way of learning is non-formal learning. This is where you learn on the job. It's how you learn a skill. It's how you might learn to sail or something like that. And this is kind of apropos nothing really, but I think it's really interesting that this non-formal way of learning is the most flexible of them all. And actually through that form of learning, you can discover a better way of doing something, which may be appropriate as we explore new ways of doing church. Because it's the most creative way. Because sometimes you discover a new way of doing something by making a mistake, don't you? The non-formal doesn't reinforce the norm in the way that socialisation and formal learning does. So, yeah, you get the point. So that's the question, isn't it? When did Jesus use any of those? Well, the formal one is the teaching, isn't it? Which I missed out earlier. The formal one is the teaching, taught on specific occasion. The non-formal was being sent out on mission, participating in other ways. Socialisation is the very heart of the way rabbis work. It's life on life. Rob Bell tells the story, doesn't he, of seeing a rabbi, or somebody seeing a rabbi in Israel go into the loo. And all his disciples followed him. They didn't necessarily want to wee, but they didn't want to miss anything he said. And the saying is that disciples are covered in the dust of their master because they walk so closely to them through that process. Jesus used all three, but I think one of the things to note is that different methods deliver different things best. And maybe this is a hobby horse of mine, just let me. But do you still get what we need in this church is deeper teaching? Yeah. I don't think we need any more teaching. We need a bit more learning. We need more learning. And it was, what's the name of the lady who went as a missionary to Hong Kong? Jackie Pullinger, or Jackie, whatever she is now. She said the trouble with Western Christians is once they understand something, they think they've done it. Once you're, and I'm looking at my own heart in this, and so the thing about discipleship, it is about application. It's about living it out. So, before coffee, and we have got time, that's great. In 203, taking the ways in which Jesus made disciples and the connection with formal, non-formal and socialisation. Just in 203, where's this happening in your context? Do you use all three, the formal, the non-formal, the socialisation? Or do you give greater weight to one or the other? Why might this be so? Is there anything you need to adjust? How might you do that? That's quite a lot to do in 10 minutes. But you can make a start, can't you? Yeah, 2s or 3s. Just begin to think about your own context and the ways in which Jesus did things. May apply. Just before we break for coffee, bad as the Anglicans after the peace. Roy Searle says, have you heard Roy Searle say this, that you can tell the different denominations by the way they share the peace. And his observation of the Baptists is they're the noisiest. Right, now it's great to hear the conversation, but carry that conversation on. But I just wonder whether there's any reflections that anybody wants to share kind of coming out of that before we hit the caffeine.
I think we read, don't forget the children.
Yes.
Like in our children's work,
Yeah.
what we are wanting to do is to make disciples as well.
Absolutely.
It's not just learn.
Yes.
That quote said, understand something, but to actually really experience Jesus.
Absolutely.
So it's not
Yes.
just, don't rule out that whole part of the church.
Thank you. And again, it's quite interesting that in the one of the problems in Shropshire, so I worked half my week. I worked for Telford Christians Together, which is 5 different churches together groups around Telford. And you'll get to know Telford next year because the Baptist Union Assembly's there. And the rest of my week, so it's 2 part-time contracts, but I spend in Shropshire doing the whole of the role. One of the challenges with Shropshire is in 2 Anglican dioceses. But the Hereford diocese, which is primarily rural market towns, they've got church commissioners' money. There's a lot of money around. And that church commissioners' money is for mission, and you have to bid for mission projects. And they've employed these, what they call intergenerational missioners, to work alongside the churches in their market towns. And I took my wife, who can be a bit cynical, to one of the launches, and they described what intergenerational meant. And afterwards she said to me, I thought that was church. And she had a point. But actually there is something, and it's a really important point, because they were recognising, hey, there is something about all generations being together, particularly in smaller churches, that there is an environment. Where else does that happen in our society? Where else do generations mix other than in families? And actually that's a challenge. The only 2 places where intergenerational happens is in church and at sporting events. At least that's what the Daily Telegraph told me 5 years ago anyway, so it must be right. There was some research about the value and the significance of church because it's places where different generations generally mix. And I think, sorry, I'm going off on one here, but there's a really helpful book on there about making disciples in messy church. And if you've ever read the book, you'll recognise some of this stuff. But I think messy church has something to teach us. But it's not always the way we do messy church. Because messy church is about around the table with the questions. They are disciple-making questions, and there is the opportunity to explore issues. And often the children are the ones who ask the direct questions and the application questions, and they are a gift often in those environments. Sorry, that was a long-winded response. Anybody else? Yeah.
Music. Some of us have no sport ability at all, but
Yes.
kids were going to ecumenical stuff, which involves the whole range of age.
Yes.
playing music together.
Yeah, yes, music, yes. And again, with youngsters, there's a much greater ability to experiment. You try and give me a musical instrument, I'm going to run away because I'm frightened of making an idiot of myself. But you were saying... Yeah, no, I'm hopeless with this. I have no sense of rhythm. And I realised that with our Portuguese-speaking congregation, because I realised that they clap to everything. I realised I had to watch somebody. That's how bad my rhythm is. I'm fine. Hand-eye coordination with the ball, no problem at all. But rhythm. Sorry, that's nothing, is it? That's obviously time for coffee, if I'm talking about things like that. Okay, let's get some coffee, carry on the conversations. And we'll have a look at we'll be back together at past.